to be talking about some of my master's research, looking at how anthropogenic boat noise affects nest defense in a singing toadfish, the plainfin midshipman. The first thing you need to know about plainfin midshipman fish are they are the coolest fish in existence, and I will fight anybody who says otherwise. So these fish live really deep most of the year, over 200 meters. And then every summer they come into the intertidal zone to breed. And these big guys called garter males nest under big rocks. And there are actually two different types of males, which Madeline will tell you all about later in this session. But these garter males dig out nest cavities under large intertidal rocks and then hum to attract females. That hum sounds like this. And Shay will tell you all about their awesome vocalizations very soon. But this hum is how the females locate the males when they're coming in from sea. These guys are really good dads. After spawning with the female, she leaves in the morning, and he stays and cares for the eggs, banding them with his fins and squirting water at them to keep them clean and fungus-free. And like the good single father he is, he spends months doing this and defending the nest from predators and rival males, as well as doing some nice housework, keeping the nest tidy, moving around shells and rocks, and raising his little babies until they're ready to swim out into the ocean on their own. And that can take several months. So this is a long and energetically costly parental care period. And it's in the harsh conditions of the intertidal zone, where they're also exposed to a lot of boat noise. You've probably heard about the negative effects of noise pollution for our orcas and other marine mammals, but it can also negatively affect fish in a lot of ways. Most fish rely heavily on sound for environmental perception, navigation, detecting predators and prey, and for communication. And the plainfin midshipman is a particularly good subject to study the effects of noise because they're very sensitive to sound and they rely on acoustic communication for successful reproduction. If noise interferes with their ability to attract a mate or to care for their young, it can have serious reproductive consequences. So I want to know whether anthropogenic boat noise would affect the defensive behavior of these garter males, nest guarding males. To do this, I had to give them something to defend their nest against. So I used these little egg predators, black claw crabs, and I would attach them to a rod so I could put them into the nest, which meant I had to make little tiny wire harnesses for live crabs, which is an interesting task to say the least. So once I had my crab on a stick, I could put it into the nest, as you can see there, and then I could see how much they attack the crab in the presence and absence of noise. So I was looking for things like biting, also behaviors like lunging at the crab, frontal fin display where they make themselves look big and scary, and their aggressive or agonistic vocalizations, grunts and growls. This next move reminds me of a dog with a chew toy. You can't tell me they're not adorable. So, to look at whether boat noise would alter this type of nest defense, I first designed a lab experiment. So here's my experimental setup, and in this experiment I was looking at males guarding empty nests, so without eggs. And then I would play boat noise through an underwater speaker and insert my crab on a stick and score the amount of defensive behaviors they exhibited towards the crab. And that's what's on the y-axis here. So each fish underwent 2 trials, one noise trial where I was playing that boat noise, and one ambient control trial where everything was the same, but there was no noise playing through the speaker. So these lines connect each individual fish's 2 trials, and this thick line shows the overall effect. as you can see, they were more defensive in the noise treatment. So this could be due to increased stress, leading to increased aggression, or it could be because of altered threat perception. So seeing the crab at the same time as hearing that loud noise might lead them to perceive the crab as a bigger threat than it really is. Either way, this can be really detrimental if they're using their energy on unnecessary defense. Both parental care behaviors and defensive behaviors are very energetically costly, and spending that extra time and energy on defense takes away from the parental care and could influence the survival of their offspring. So I wanted to know whether this would be the same in the field. I went to my beautiful field site in Washington, did some fun free diving, and this time looked at males that were guarding nests with eggs. And because of logistical constraints with bringing a speaker into the field, we use these little devices called noise eggs as their noise stimulus. They battery operated and vibrate, and they produce a low frequency tone. So, what did we find in the field? Nothing. As you can see with this straight line showing the overall effect, they on average showed the same amount of defense in the noise treatment as they did in the ambient control treatment. So why did our results differ between the lab and the field experiments? The first thing to notice is just that they were performing a lot more behaviors in general in the field. If you look at the y-axis, it goes to 30 in the lab and 60 in the field. So they were just more defensive overall, regardless of noise treatment in the field. This was likely due to the fact that they had eggs in the field and not in the lab. It makes sense that you would spend more time on defense and put more energy into it when you're defending your offspring rather than just your territory. Another big difference between the studies was that noise stimulus, the boat noise in the lab and noise egg in the field. So here, just want you to look at the pink lines, and these are power spectral density plots, and they're just showing what noise the fish was exposed to during each of the experiments. So you can see that on the y-axis here is amplitude, or how loud the sound was, and on the x-axis is frequency, so how high or low the pitch was. And you can see that the maximum noise level in the lab was a lot higher than it was in the field. And that is a difference of about 15 decibels, which doesn't sound like a lot, but decibels are on a logarithmic scale, so it's actually a really big difference. The third thing that differed between experiments and likely led to that difference in results was the environment that they were tested in. So we had this artificial lab environment where they were in tanks compared to this nice naturalistic wild habitat. And we expect animals to behave differently in captivity than they would in the wild. So to summarize, we saw an increase in the amount of defensive behavior exhibited during noise in the lab experiment. And we saw more defense overall in the field, but our noise treatment in the field, those noise eggs, didn't elicit any behavioral responses. The difference in results in our two studies were likely due to differences in the context in which they were tested, including difference in reproductive state, difference in that noise stimulus that was used, and different testing environments. So, what's next? Well, I plan to continue doing more field research because we need to further investigate what is actually happening in the wild when they're exposed to boat noise. We can't conclude from my field study that they're not affected by noise, that they don't alter their defense because of noise, because I don't think that noise egg was a realistic enough stimulus, and it was probably just too quiet. Therefore, I plan to use a more realistic stimulus. Next, a real motorboat, because you can't get much more realistic than that when you're looking at boat noise. So, I will continue these studies this summer, looking at how noise affects both defense in midshipmen and parental care, so that my research can contribute to our growing understanding of how noise affects fish and other marine life, which can help us implement better conservation strategies that limit the amount of harmful noise in the ocean. Thank you. And I'd like to, oh, sorry. I'd like to acknowledge everybody that was part of this research.
Are you doing that?
No.
Yeah.
But I think yeah, I don't know. Team Midshipman is the best, so thank you. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Are there any questions?
Yes.
Is there a possibility that since the midshipmen in the wild, presumably, like depending on how close they might have been to anchorages or ship traffic, like is it possible that they could have habituated before your arrival?
Yes, that's something that really interested in as well. There is some research on other species showing that fish in high motorboat disturbance areas are less affected or change their behavior less in response to introduced noise in experiments. So yes, it is possible. Any other questions? Yes.
Are you planning to run the lab experiments again at all with more replicates? And if so, would you be using, is there a way to use like the same motorboat noise that you're going to be taking in the field to have a more accurate comparison between the noise treatments?
So I'm not planning on repeating any more lab experiments. I think lab studies can be really valuable because you can control everything, but they are not always an accurate representation of what's really going on in the world. So my focus will be switching to field studies and having more replicates in the field studies with a good realistic stimulus. Yes?
I was curious, like when you're in the field and like diving down, if you think that you're influencing their behavior at all by sneaking up on them.
Yeah, we could be. We definitely, so we're not around them during the trials. We put the cameras into the nests and then swim away from them and then retrieve them later. And we don't count the first few minutes as they're habituating. And that's definitely something that designing a longer period this summer so that they can have time to settle after that disturbance. Mm-hmm.
What's the what effect might terrestrial source noises have effect? Because I know a lot of midshipman habitat is along highways.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's definitely something I've thought about. I think terrestrial noise could definitely affect them. However, I think it's not as big a concern because when they're in their little tiny pools underwater at low tide, they're not doing much. So I think the bigger concern is when they're underwater, and then they're more exposed to those underwater sound sources. And those are also the times that they're active in their parental care and defense, and when they're humming to attract mates. And so I think it'd be really interesting to know if it does raise their stress levels or anything, but I think the bigger concern would be the underwater noise.